Very happy to have this wake up call this morning with you, Kate. Um, for various reasons, of course, the taxonomy is under preparation when it comes to water criteria in the longer run and biodiversity. And of course, we are debating the still the climate criteria. But the water is a bit overcast by the climate discussions, and even though that is the most acute and concretely felt challenge is what we have, and this has been, as we know, for quite long time, and we would need to solve and take into account the resource scarcity, water being the most precious resource on this context, the climate change pressures on this, and try to mingle the juggle all the balls together. And I couldn't find any better person to talk for us through than Kate Lamb from Disclosure Insight Action, CDP. And you are the global director for water security and a high level climate champion leader for water on UNFCCC. You have a 20 years experience on all aspects of the sustainable development, corporate engagement, and of course, team leadership, how to make the things happen. And while you are leading this water security initiative, um, you are looking from the global high level perspective, uh, what would be the gold standard for disclosure of corporate and city water related information globally? And what actions really with this information could rapidly deliver significant changes in corporate and city behaviors towards water? And I was astonished when we dealt with the water directive how much waste we do have in different parts of the processes in water. So we really would need to overthink the whole thing. And in addition, you are, as I said, the high level climate champion leader for water. And this is very important role because this drives the ambitions and the actions from very wide variety of non-state actors. So we are not only leading it on the hands of governments what needs to happen. So with these words, I would like to, of course, welcome you, Kate, and to all of our participants in this wake-up call. And whenever you are ready, please, Kate, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for welcoming me along this morning on this is a very auspicious day, of course, because it is World Water Day. And so I'm really excited to have just a few minutes of your time this morning to hopefully inspire you to use your positions of influence to help stem the global water crisis. It's something I feel very passionately about. As you've just heard, I've been working on this topic for a very long time. And I find that once you dip your toe in the water, it's very difficult to take it out again. I'll just touch briefly for a moment on the water climate nexus, as was just mentioned a moment ago. And whilst absolutely climate change is front and centre of everybody's minds at the moment, particularly from an ecological crisis perspective, it is worth remembering or reflecting on the fact that the vast majority of climate impacts are felt through water. We have a saying here at CDP that if climate change is the shark, then water is its teeth. But in reality, even if we stem the global climate crisis, or when we stem the global climate crisis, there will still be a problem with the way in which we manage and distribute our freshwater resources. Solving the climate crisis alone will not help stem the water crisis. But I hope to be able to inspire you today into understanding a little bit more about what this issue is, what it means, how it affects us all, and some of the actions that I think you can take. Now, this isn't your usual presentation. I don't have a huge amount of slides. I have some, and I'll probably inelegantly flip between them and my speech as we go along. So please forgive me whilst we go. Reality is, I love working on water. I've often considered moving out even recently thinking about new jobs and whether I should be working on different topics. But this thing has got a complete grip of me, and it's likely to remain my life's ambition for the next 30, 40 years, I would imagine. It's a fascinating topic, and one that I'm, as I said, completely hooked on. And what I hope to do with you today is inspire you to do all you can in your capacity as legislators and leaders to protect this precious resource, a resource for which there really is no alternative. And I think this is an important point that I want to dwell on for a moment. What most people often don't consider is that unlike fossil fuels, for which we can harness the power of the wind, the waves, and the sun, there really are no alternatives to water. We have what we've been given, and we therefore must make the absolute best use of it. And I'm here because water insecurity is real. It's happening right now to millions and millions of people around the world. And sadly, it really is dire, and we are not succeeding in achieving our global goals on water. But I'm also here because I believe that water insecurity is a solvable crisis. And I think we need to approach this challenge with hope rather than with fear. Now, like most of you, I took water for granted for most of my life. That is, until my first job straight out of university. And I wanted to share a picture of me with you on some of my first days in this role. I work, hopefully you can see this. I'm going to make it as to a large full screen image. This is 21-year-old me working on a duck farm in the middle of rural England, contemplating what the hell I was going to do with all of this muck. Now, for a 21-year-old, this was it was certainly a daunting challenge. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because then you can see my speaking notes as well. So you can see my inelegance of sharing these, but I will do my best. So please bear with me. The farm was a family-run business, and it had grown from slaughtering around 30 ducks a week to processing more than 30 million ducks per year. The task that they set me was to gain ISO 14001 compliance, a compliance scheme indicating that the company was doing all it could to minimize its environmental impacts. The job quickly brought me into contact with water, specifically what the company knew about the water and where it was coming from and who else depended on it, but also how the company treated its wastewater before it left their sites. You see, the company wasn't connected to any mains water supply nor water sewage treatment system. And I was shocked at what I found. I was shocked at their knowledge and attitude toward the resource, a resource that was so plainly essential to their ability to operate. But their attitudes were so at odds with the role that this resource played in helping them succeed as a business. They had, for example, no idea where their water was coming from, nor how much they were abstracting each year. At the same time, they had no interest whatsoever in treating the foul-smelling black wastewater that they were responsible for. Indeed, they felt no pressure from regulators, customers, or local communities to change. And I quickly learned that this same attitude prevailed across the whole poultry processing sector in the UK. And that was my first aha moment. A moment when I realised that the scale of the mismanagement of the most precious resource, the resource that is essential to life, at that point, in addition to running around like an evangelical person trying to convince the company to change their behaviour, I took off my rose-tinted swimming goggles and dived deeply into the issues, pun intended. This learning took me on a journey, one that made me realise that water isn't just the stuff that comes out of taps or flushes the toilet, if you were lucky, like no doubt you are, to have a house with a stable supply of water. But I also realised that it's absolutely everywhere, and it's in everything. It's in the jumpers that we're wearing, the food that you will no doubt eat for breakfast and lunch today, in the cars and buses that we drive, and in the money that we spend. Indeed, I realised that water is the difference between education and illiteracy for millions of girls and women around the world. And it's fish and rice for dinner every night of the week for people all across Southeast Asia. So when we choose to deprioritize water and its mismanagement, human potential is squandered, economies get hammered, and national security is threatened. When we harness the power and potential of water, however, the reverse is true. Let's think for a moment about how we need water in our society. We need water for domestic purposes, of course, for taking away the waste that we produce, but we also need water for agriculture. As some of you may already know, agriculture consumes most of the water on the planet. Water allows our cities to grow, it allows our industries to thrive, and it allows nature itself to flourish, for those beautiful places that we care about, for our biodiversity to thrive. And we need water for energy too, including for the transition to the net zero future that we're all striving for. Where, after all, do you think the raw ingredients for green hydrogen, H2, come from? H2O. So let's consider some statistics here. 2 billion people still lack access to water in their homes. We've witnessed an 84% decline in all life living in rivers, lakes, and streams since the 1970s. That's the largest loss of life anywhere on the planet. And 80% of our wastewater leaves factories, farms, and homes untreated. The farm and the factory that I worked at all those years ago, unfortunately, is the rule rather than the exception. And at the same time, renewable resources of water per capita are declining in almost every country. And yet, we need to double the amount of water we need for agriculture by 2040. And in the same time period, water demand for energy, even under a net zero scenario, is set to rise by 40%. So why are we in this predicament? Well, there are a number of reasons, including, sadly, a complete lack of political will, corruption and neglect in many regions. Rampant short-termism is a real bind, as well as a lack of market signals such as pricing that reflects water's true value. But at the heart of it, I believe, certainly for those of us in the West, myself included, we've all been labouring under the assumption that water will always be there in the quality that we need it, wherever we need it, and whenever we need it. And this fundamental assumption is the thing that's flawed, because that is no longer the case. But it's this fundamental assumption, most of the time unspoken, that sits at the heart of every business model that you can think of. It was certainly the assumption of the duck producer that I used to work for. And we see it also in Tesla's expansion into Germany, which has recently hit the headlines with Bloomberg covering the fact that the factory expansion in Germany is suffering delays driven by groundwater concerns. A concern that Elon Musk laughed off 6 months ago, said it was not a problem at all. And we're also seeing that Unilever's growth forecasts in India, which had to be revised downwards when they realised that the consumers that they want to sell to are unlikely to have access to the water needed to use their products. You can see clear real-world examples, and these are just two, where water and the assumption about its availability is unspoken but sits at the heart of all of these business models. And that's when I had my next aha moment. Because businesses in the energy, chemical, mining, food, beverage, textile, finance, and pharmaceutical sectors wield influence over around 70% of the world's available water supply. I realised that given the central role that business plays in the way in which water is consumed and treated, motivating them to confront that assumption, to understand that the assumption exists and that it's imperiling their business, might just hold the key to encouraging them to grow differently and reduce their dependence and impacts on freshwater resources. And that's when I joined CDP. And in the decades since then, I've seen water issues rise up the agenda. I think it's safe to say that it's become a real hot topic. You'll have seen it in the media, we see it from donors, and we're seeing it in government with the, for example, 66 central banks that form the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS for short, acknowledging that the water crisis poses a threat to financial stability. And we see it in mainstream business, with, for example, the likes of Moody's downgrading entire sectors due to water risk, as happened with the mining sector multiple times over the last 5 years. And all of this, excitingly, is driving the issue of water security forward in a very different way. It's moved the issue of tackling the water crisis out of the hands of, solely out of the hands of governments and civil society actors, and into the hands of mainstream financial institutions and multinational corporations. When I started at CDP, we operated and had around 150 investors with 50 trillion in assets requesting companies to disclose water-related data via CDP in the platform that I managed. Today, we now operate on behalf of 680 investors with 120 trillion in assets requesting that same data. And companies are responding, 3,500 of them every year. And I've been privileged to witness firsthand the impact of this effort. We've enabled investors to ask companies what, on the face of it, appears to be a very simple question through our questionnaire. And that question is, are you exposed to water-related risks that could generate a substantive change in your business? Now put yourself in the shoes of a company receiving that request for the very first time. When they've received this question, again for the very first time, most companies do not know the answer, because for many of them it's the first time they've had to consider such a question. Like the duck company I worked for, they don't know where the keys are to the meter room, let alone where their water comes from and how that might change into the future. It's therefore a hugely powerful question, particularly when asked on behalf of such a powerful group of financial institutions. That one question alone, and it's safe to say, or I should say that it's one question amongst many in our questionnaire, but that one question alone enables companies to go on a real journey themselves to understand why water matters, where it matters, and what they need to do better to ensure that they have what they need today and into the future. Thanks to this disclosure mechanism, we've succeeded in bringing water out of the boiler room and into the boardroom, and spark action on the issue that 10 years ago was nascent at best. As the Chinese proverb states, not only can water float a boat, but it can sink it also. We've been able to help businesses around the world realize that water can be a significant driver of innovative and sustainable economic prosperity. We've also helped them understand, however, that its mismanagement can result in significant business failure. More than ever before, finance and business leaders realize that their long-term profitability, even viability, depends on having the right quantity and quality of water available at the right time and place, not only to meet their needs, but also to meet the needs of the people and ecosystems that they depend upon. Whether it's Anglo-American tying CEO remuneration to performance against freshwater reduction targets, or Ford Motor Company aiming to eliminate water withdrawals from all of their manufacturing sites, we're seeing firms want to grow differently, and as such, reduce their impacts on fresh water, making more of it available to those that need it most. This awakening is really exciting and a real cause for optimism, particularly when one remembers the size and influence of the financial market itself. With $124 trillion of assets, the banking industry alone is bigger, more profitable, and more powerful than ever before. And yet, according to a study by JP Morgan, less than 2% of allocation made by all of these financial institutions is graded as sustainable. That means, in other words, that 98% is not rated as sustainable. 98% of all of the money flowing throughout the economy today is actively working against our goals and undermining our ability to achieve a water secure, net zero, resilient future for all. This flow of money, as it relates to water, is enabling agribusinesses to pump ever-increasing amounts of non-renewable groundwater, the theme of this year's World Water Day. It's enabling tailings dams to be constructed at the heads of free-flowing rivers, and it's enabling chemical, apparel, and pharmaceutical companies to release toxic pollution, much of which is carcinogenic, posing a real and present danger to human health, not only in developing economies, but right here at home. But it can also be the key to changing all of this. Imagine for a moment if this flow of capital was working in our favour. Imagine if it was providing the incentive, the spark needed for the world to grow and hence affect freshwater resources differently. For the last decade, those investors that I mentioned that CDP works on behalf of, they've played the role of the scrutineers. They've requested water-related data from companies in which they invest, but they've never once had to disclose themselves or tell anybody else what they're doing with that data, or indeed what they're doing to address the water crisis in their own portfolios or loan books. Rather excitingly, with the very kind help from the Dutch government, CDP and my team in particular are about to change all of this. Next month, we'll issue for the first time a water-related questionnaire to more than 1,000 publicly listed financial institutions, asking them the very same question we ask of companies, only slightly tweaked. Are your portfolios or loan books exposed to water-related risks that could generate a substantive change in your business? It's this that gets me out of bed in the morning and gives me reason to remain optimistic. I'm optimistic that, like our corporate disclosure efforts before it, this question alone will create or catalyse action within those financial institutions that will cascade through the real economy, triggering a true transformation in the way in which we value water. Because again, you can imagine HSBC confronted with this question. They then have to ask the companies that they loan to or invest in about the actions they're taking to reduce their risks and impacts. It's a very exciting prospect. And what about you? Well, you have a lot of power in this discussion, clearly, and I hope that you feel inspired today to act, because there are clear steps that you can take. Of course, on a personal level, I could perhaps recommend taking a shower with a friend, but on a professional level too, you can bring about a transformation in a way that I can only dream of. You see, CDP's success on water disclosure has been brought about on a voluntary basis. We are a civil society organisation with just 400 staff, but a lot of credibility, thankfully. When I started, we had just 35 staff. To grow to 400 is really encouraging, but it's not enough to achieve our goals. We've succeeded, despite our size, in normalising water disclosure across a range of sectors and geographies, but it's nowhere near the scale we need to really deliver a water secure future for all. And our work on financial institution water disclosure, it's only just starting, and it might take another decade to reach the scale that we're at today with corporations. And science, sadly, is telling us that we don't have that time to wait. Without a doubt, ensuring that our investment, lending, and insurance policies harness the power of the market to work for water, protecting it for future generations to come, is an absolutely essential and ambitious undertaking. The leadership on show across the EU at the moment, if adopted at scale, will position us well to deliver it. For example, your work to integrate water into the EU taxonomy, into the EFRAG standards and CSRD is absolutely vital and heralds a new dawn for water disclosure and action. Please keep it up. In particular, adopting a double materiality approach to these endeavours has been critical, particularly for water, because it's worth remembering that although the impact of a business on freshwater resources is highly material, and indeed the dependence of that business on having the right amount of water available at the right time is hugely material, the current low pricing of water itself means that financially, in many cases, water appears merely as noise on a profit and loss sheet. And yet, at the same time, we all know that fines issued on behalf of water regulators are far from a meaningful economic deterrent. Indeed, in many cases, it's sadly cheaper to pollute than not. So persisting with a double materiality approach to framework development is essential, and ensuring that water-related reporting requirements that you set are aimed at financial institutions in addition to large water users is really what I'm here to plead for today, because this will allow us to really tap the potential of both the market and of water. In closing, I want to leave you with one final thought. I find it fascinating that in our current ventures into space, our explorations of Mars, the thing that we're looking to find above all else is water, because we all know deep down that water is life. And it's helpful, I find, to be reminded of it every now and again, because what I hope I've convinced you today is that water is too valuable a currency to be spent poorly. So happy World Water Day. And I'm all yours for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Cate, for your excellent presentation. And now I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. I certainly have some myself, but I would like to, I'm just looking the chat box, would like to give the floor for others if you would like to start first. I do not see any hands yet, so please do raise your hands when you are ready to comment. So I'll go with a couple of mine first. Firstly, if we sort of see the resource efficiency demand scale that is almost tenfold, with tenth of the resources we would need to produce the same welfare, the same also ability to compete in global economy, and the profit limits in margins in companies. So do you think that the indicators that you are using and that what we are using are adequate on that level? Or is there still some new ones what we would need to be expecting? For example, on the demanding the reuse of the water, the grey waters, and the whole system that we would basically need to build that on. And the second is that you touched quite rightly, as we asked you to, the private side. And of course, there's a lot of what the companies could do, and some of them are already doing. But then what about the public sector that is there mainly the provider for the services for fresh water and the wastewater? How could we create a better systems there, and what is your understanding of the awareness and activity on this side?
Two really great questions. Thank you, Sepa. So on the water use efficiency indicators, you're absolutely right. They are vital indicators to demonstrate that companies are optimizing their use. And we know that in many cases still that companies are lagging on that front. It's worth remembering and being mindful of the fact that efficiency measures are not themselves resilient, or may not result in a resilient business, and they can have unintended consequences, particularly in times of scarcity. So they can't be the only indicators that we look to assess a company on and ensure that they are likely to be doing both all they can to reduce their impacts, whilst also remaining resilient in times of a changing climate. Reuse issue is an absolutely vital area, and we're looking at the moment with the Climate Champions work that I do to kickstart a wastewater reuse revolution. This is an untapped area of potential. Wastewater itself is a huge untapped supply of energy. Right, you can convert a lot of the waste materials that are in wastewater into alternative sources of energy. At the same time, it's a really fabulous resource for agricultural material that can help grow crops to grow more vibrantly. At the same time, it's also a really fabulous source of alternative water, again, in times of scarcity. And yet we're not seeing companies using and pursuing a reuse approach as much as we would like. We have gone back and forth as an institution about whether to include a volumetric indicator of reuse. And for a time period, we did try that. But in the end, we've decided to not progress with that indicator. A lot of companies were struggling with the indicator itself, and there's an awful lot of effort that went into trying to measure that, when in fact what we really needed to be measuring solely was the amount of fresh water that was being withdrawn and then and discharged back into the system. The reuse is a means to that end, but it's not the only mechanism. So we try to measure the deployment of reuse in different ways, asking companies, do they use it, where do they use it, and to what extent they've deployed that across all of their assets. So that could be something that we consider. At the same time, I've also mentioned about the fact that it's their growth prospects that are likely to be affected by freshwater resources. And whilst we can look at, and a lot of the historical data set that CDP has, a lot of the historical indicators that we've used are backward looking. They look at how freshwater resources, how withdrawals have changed over time as the company has grown and changed their performance. We're now pivoting to look at indicators that are more forward looking to understand how the company wants to grow, where they're going to be reliant on freshwater resources in the future, how their products and services are going to be, whether they're going to need to be adapted for a water secure future, and if so, how the company is going about adapting those. And we're finding a genuine excitement amongst the financial market for those types of forward-looking indicators that give a true understanding of where the company is headed. And so again, some of those indicators that we would be able to share with you in a separate document after the meeting for you to consider could be something that we look forward to working together on. And with regards to water utility companies themselves, we focused on them particularly from a climate perspective last year, because they have got a significant role in the climate agenda to play, both from a mitigation and a resilience perspective. And here in the UK, we saw a large number of water utilities committing to net zero carbon emissions long before they're legally obliged to do so. In fact, many of them committed to net zero by 2030. They are huge. The sector as a whole emits the same amount of carbon as Australia does, or as the whole shipping sector does. But it's generally overlooked because it's perceived to be a water sector and therefore essential, and water is green, therefore you are a green company. But as we know, that's not the case. They issue large amounts of methane, and so they're a critical sector to focus on from a methane reporting perspective, because it's one of our quickest wins for halting short-term climate change by eliminating methane emissions. But it's also important to reflect on the fact that they have a significant role in enabling resilient outcomes for people, and that much of their infrastructure within the water supply companies are not yet resilient to changes in climate. And so more effort is needed within that sector, we believe, to encourage and motivate those companies to ensure that the resilience, that the infrastructure that they supply is resilient to changes in climate, because the top 50 water utilities in the world serve over 1 billion people. So we could get those 50 companies into a room and have a dramatic outcome for 1 billion people would be really wonderful to accelerate.
Then I'm looking for the hands. Still, I do not see anyone. So please just.
Heidi has a question, Sirpa.
Yeah, okay, please do go ahead and.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you very much. 2 questions. I don't know if this is so much about the investors, but I think it was a great win that the UN defined in the context. I think it must have been Rio +20, that indeed water and sanitation are human rights. So are you counting sanitation into your questionnaires and the objectives, which I believe is a really big global development issue? And then second question, closer to home perhaps, now because of the war, we see that there is a tendency to cancel certain legislative reforms because of disruptions in supply chains. etc., etc. And now, for instance, the EU farm to fork strategy seems to be under threat. So could you say something from the point of view of water circulation, circular economy and water in the EU agriculture policies, and perhaps more closely on the farm to fork, which I believe we have to defend? Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. So on water and sanitation as a human right and whether or not we include it in our questionnaires, the answer is yes, we do, particularly with sanitation as well. Well, both. We ask companies, because we're typically targeting at the moment large publicly listed entities, it's generally a lack of water, sanitation and hygiene issue predominantly resides in their factories overseas and in their supply chains. And most companies don't often understand or know whether their staff within their supply chains have got access to water, taps, toilets and soap, basically, and safely functioning ones in the workforce, so within the places of work where they're located. And so we do our best to shine a light on that and encourage companies to explore that issue by asking for disclosure on the topic. We ask them whether they monitor that across their direct operations and their supply chains, and we reward them points if they do. We also ask them if they set targets on whether or not their staff within their direct operations and supply chains have access. And again, we reward points for companies that do have them. One thing I didn't touch on in my presentation, actually, in addition to the disclosure mechanism that we run, we also score each disclosure that is presented to us, and we provide those scores back to the company themselves, so they have a benchmark that they can use to assess their performance against their peers, both from a geography and a regional perspective. But we also load those scores straight into the financial system itself. So they are loaded onto Bloomberg terminals, for example, where they're downloaded 1 million times every 6 weeks and used to inform financial decisions. So that benchmarking is a critical role that we play as well. With regards to the inclusion of water in the EU farm to fork strategy, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Heidi. It must be defended at all costs. We know, as we're seeing already with the energy crisis and our attempts to shift away from Russia at the moment because of our dependence on oil and gas, it is the security issue, the national security issue, that is driving that above all else. That speed that we within the climate community, could have wished had happened 30 years ago, that if we could move with this speed in a lot of respects. The same implications for security and national security apply for water. We often see that water is used as a weapon of war. You can see it with ISIS in Iraq, when ISIS was working to gain control over key strategic water supply sources and major reservoirs and dams that fed some of the largest cities across Iraq. Thankfully, they did not succeed in gaining control of those assets, but had they had, there would have been a humanitarian catastrophe. We see Russia targeting freshwater supplies and water-related infrastructure in Ukraine, and that too playing out in catastrophic ways for the residents of Mariupol. We're seeing water conflicts all over particularly across the Middle East and African continent, where freshwater resources, they don't respect the boundaries of countries. It generally will flow across all countries, and there's some really fabulous experiences and examples across Europe where countries have come together to acknowledge this shared resource, and we're collectively to manage it in the spirit of a collective and collegiate spirit. We call these agreements, they are transboundary water agreements. In some key regions, however, these transboundary agreements do not exist. In fact, there are fewer transboundary water agreements than there are transboundary water agreements. And so we really need to be pushing those as a solution to the global climate and water crisis. But with regards to farm to fork strategy, as I mentioned earlier, agriculture consumes around 70% of freshwater resources worldwide. And we will need more freshwater resources if we are to feed a growing population. And as a result, the two are intrinsically linked. and therefore defending that strategy, ensuring that we continue to deliver on it, is an absolute essential aspect of work that I would be delighted to support you on.
Thank you. And I do not see any hands right now, so anyone willing to speak, just raise your voice, please.
I think Juha Salso-Leikas may want to ask a question since he's put his video on.
Yours, please. You are unmuted at the moment, so. While we are waiting, yours to unmute himself and get the connection right, because he just joined a minute ago. Oh, now I see green light on you, yours. Would you like to comment?
Thank you, Sirpa. Thank you very much, Cate, for very interesting presentation. Indeed, the water is very important for one, but how you see in the future how we can increase the possibilities to have independent supply of water in particularly in the region of conflicts, as we discussed now the Russian war against the Ukraine, the supply in this situation, and what is the possibilities of international society to support the people in this situations. Thank you very much.
It's a really fabulous question again, and one that you mentioned the word independent water supplies. I think the reality is that is unlikely to ever be the case. As I mentioned, this water, the hydrological system, doesn't respect international boundaries and will never respect national boundaries. There will always be shared resources, whether they are above ground or below ground. We have aquifers that are vast, covering 3, 4, 5 different countries below ground that each of those countries depend upon. And we can never do anything to stop that being the hydrological reality that we're faced with. That's why the importance of these transboundary water agreements are so vital, and the need for water diplomacy as a skill to be enhanced and harnessed. We're seeing some fabulous courses emerging in particularly in Switzerland, where you can go and train to be a water diplomat. My case and my argument will be that every diplomat that we have should be a water diplomat, rather than having specific water diplomats in place, because this will always be a shared resource, like the air that we breathe. It's unlike fossil fuels, where we can, as I mentioned at the beginning, harness the power of the wind and the waves and the sun. There really are no alternatives to freshwater resources, particularly for those countries and cities that are very far away from the sea. Right? So we could harness seawater, for example, and we can desalinate that if you are close to the coast. And for an awful lot of people, that is an alternative option, but for the vast majority, it isn't. And so the need to understand where these shared resources are, particularly in places of conflict, and endeavour to strike agreements between those countries slowly but surely, will inevitably, I think, have to be a tool in our toolkit for long-term stability and security. But there are people much closer, much more adept at me at talking about this issue on water and peace. And I would love to make some recommendations as to who they are. I can maybe speak with the team after the event who can come and present to you on it. There are some lovely tools that have been established that help individuals understand where conflict is likely to arise over water resources, so that we're well prepared to lean in sooner rather than later and endeavour to address the issues before they become more severe. If I might end on this one with, again, a reason for optimism, because I do try to be an optimist wherever I can. It's hard at sometimes, but you often hear about water wars, right? It's a very glamorized term that the press love particularly, but our experience has been that there are many, many, many more instances of water cooperation rather than war. There are whilst I'm lamenting the fact that there are not enough transboundary water agreements, There are in fact 234 of them, and yet there are a smaller handful of water conflicts and water wars. Now that balance might be tipped as climate change worsens and the effect of climate change leads to less water overall. Hence the reason why we need more transboundary agreements in place. But right now, if we look at history as a signal as to where we may go, cooperation is much more likely to abound rather than conflict.
Thank you, Agnes. And yes, please send the information to Roland, and so we can distribute it to all of our members. As you know, the Ukraine crisis makes this discussion very, very acute at the moment in the Parliament. And thank you for the optimism as well. So please do send those links to of the good examples how this can be enhanced. Then the next comment is for Agnes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sirpa. Good morning. I don't have a question. I would just like to provide a comment and a big thank to Cate for her extremely inspiring intervention. So I represent Ecolab, and as you may know, Ecolab supports at the global level an ambitious agenda to achieve a sustainable water management. And I wanted to really encourage all the participants to work with us to advance the, let's say, the water management agenda at global level. We as Ecolab, we have, let's say, our mission to help the industry to reduce energy and greenhouse gas emissions and progress on their net zero journey. And I just wanted to, let's say, reinforce the message that Cate, Sirpa, we are with you to help and shape a more sustainable and ambitious agenda impacting water management at a global level. So thank you, a warm thank you for your very inspiring words.
Thank you, Agnes, and thank you for participating as an Ecolab. We've learned quite a lot from you about the wonderful possibilities that the technology would enable us to use the water more effectively and sparingly. So it's very important to have that knowledge on board with us. Then do we have the next speakers here? Achim, you put a question on the chat. Do you want to put it on out loud on yourself, please?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Speaking from the perspective of international company that has as well significant water use in their extended value chains for agricultural commodities, but also providing mineral water to consumers, and exploring the potentials to shape our commitments and activities around water in a meaningful way. So in line with the discussion on carbon neutrality, we see an increasing interest from companies to explore the potential to shape meaningful commitments also related to water. So, Cate, how would you see the potential to move forwards in a systematic way with net zero water commitments, being aware of the fact that water is always a shared resource and no company can manage, work or improve on water management alone? Do you have from CDP considerations on this potential for the future to get companies on board?
Thank you, Achim. It's a really pertinent and timely question. There has been a lack of a framework for a long time to effectively harness the commitments of companies and help them to tell their story, I suppose, in a way that resonates beyond water professionals, right? The likes of me. I understand that water is a complex issue and there needs to be a whole range of targets, ultimately, or commitments that really demonstrate a company is serious about this topic. And in the absence of such a framework, we do see these types of commitments emerging. I think there's a couple of companies that are now using the net zero water framing for their targets. But there are many other companies that are using different frameworks. It might be replenish, right, is another one where they've looked to replenish, offset the water that they've consumed in their products by investing in river basin management, for example, or reforesting river basins. Whilst I see that there is a need for target setting in this way and for presenting pledges or corporate commitments in a way that resonates, they are open to an awful lot of flaws, of course, and typically the vast majority are not based in sound science. And so as we saw with net zero carbon commitments that were made last year, you could poke holes in them, and they were open to an awful lot of scrutiny as a result. Companies were not making disingenuous pledges. Each pledge was somewhat different from another. So you might get one genuine company committed to absolute emission reduction targets by 2030 across their entire business, whilst the other is looking at 2 factories down the road and they'll get there by 2050. Not great. And so the need for a standard is essential. And we at CDP have been working in partnership with a number of other civil society actors for the last 2 years to develop a science-based target framework for freshwater. You might be aware of the fact that there is a science-based target for climate change known as SBTI. It's catchy. We don't do a great job of naming a lot of our initiatives. We need to get a marketer in place, I think. But anyway, we've established the science-based targets for climate, right, which makes sure that companies' net zero targets are informed and based on the best available science. And that is where we sit as an institution. And we encourage and motivate companies to take those targets. So companies that have set a science-based target for climate get more points than those that don't. Those that are making progress on them get even more points than those that aren't making progress. We have been working on a same framework for freshwater resources. We work with WWF, WRI, the UN CEO Water Mandate, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy in order to develop this framework. It's part of the Science-Based Target Network that has been set up by PIC, Potsdam Institute. So this framework, we've been piloting a range of different approaches over the last 1.5 years, and we will be issuing the first publicly available methodology in May of this year. And at that point, then, that is what I will be expecting and what CDP will be driving to be the standard against which corporate targets are set for water. And that will, I hope, in a sense, eliminate the need for net zero water commitments, because we know that we've got a methodology that is grounded in the best possible hydrological science that will showcase that the companies are taking meaningful action to address water resources in the whole, right? And one of the beauties of this methodology, Akim, is that it does take into consideration the fact that it is possible to achieve a water efficient factory, but that water efficient factory will be a clean fish in a dirty pond, as I like to say. That if you fail to address the boundaries of the basin within them, then you will still be exposed to risk and challenges that you will not be addressing by being efficient. So the methodology that we've established for science-based targets for freshwater take into account the context of the basin and make sure that the actions companies take are in accordance with what the basin needs and what the business needs. Hopefully that's helped.
Absolutely, very clear. Thank you.
Excellent.
Looking forward to the main publication.
Me too.
Well, I think that we are looking for that publication and information, and this is extremely important what you said. This is the double maturity and the bigger picture, that you don't look only from door to door and how efficient you are in closed environment, because anyway you are a part of the bigger ecosystem. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing the clock approaching to 9 o'clock. I would have still one quick comment question, but I would like to give the floor to you if there's someone else who would like to use the slot. If not, before thanking, my last would be that could you share not only right now and after this meeting, but in the longer run, your comments and proposals for the upcoming taxonomy. I think that would be very extremely useful for all of us. How should we measure the water? How should we develop this taxonomy? What would be the golden standard? And please do remind the fact that we are sometimes having a bit of challenge in the Commission that the first level of a regulation says it needs to be science-based and it needs to be based on indicators so you can measure what you do. And what is the most important, significantly better than the industry average and based on the best usable and available technology. So the bar actually is pretty high, and this is what we try to safeguard here in the Parliament and of course in the Global EU, that we would really streamline our targets and criteria accordingly.
I'd be delighted to, Sirpa. As I mentioned earlier, you know, the opportunity at hand here with these instruments are it's really exciting for someone like myself who's been channeling away at water disclosure from a voluntary basis for the last decade, to see it emerge in this way at the scale that is promised and at the level of ambition that is promised is I think really holds an opportunity for us to deliver a significant dent in the global water crisis. And I'm really excited, and we'll certainly send through everything that we have that will help inform your thinking on that front.
So thank you very much to all of you who participated in this wake-up call. I hope you got your morning coffee as well. I did mine. And a special thank you for you, Cate, for your input and your time you reserved for us. And let's stay in contact. And as said, please do deliver the materials for us. And for all the participants, I'm sure that Cate can answer to your direct questions or comments if you wish to be in contact with her also later on.
Absolutely, Sirpa. I've just put my I'll put my email address in the chat. Should anybody like to reach out, I'm always available. But thank you so much for having me. Happy World Water Day again. Do tweet about water today. If you've got a Twitter or a LinkedIn account, do consider just putting a little bit of something, a nudge to the global water crisis. I think we would all be greatly appreciate that. But have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in person in 3D, perhaps at some point.
Hopefully, let's hope so. And yes, to everybody, once again, thank you, Cate, and a wonderful water day. Let's value it, try to save it, and at the same time consume it when it is good and clean, and we can do it. So have a very nice day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.